question that got me thinking about how ableist ideology affects all of us. And one way it affects us is that it leads us to hide our own impairments. It leads us to disguise our impairments because we know that if other people see us as having an impairment, they might define us as being deficient or inferior. So if we have some impairment that prevents us from doing something, then we will avoid doing that in front of other people because we don't want other people to see our impairment and our little disability. So what happens is, because of that, we create this illusion that we are all normal and that we don't have impairments. But when we do that, we make it very difficult for people who have observable impairments and who have serious inabilities to do certain things. So then those people withdraw from that's why I have that box, the empire of the normal. They withdraw from the empire of the normal. They don't feel welcome. And so then we have a segregation between people who are defined as normal and people who are defined as having a disability or being deficient or being inferior. So, because if someone thinks you're inferior, you will withdraw and you won't participate. So in most societies, we have segregation of people who are considered to be normal and people who are considered to be disabled or people with disabilities. And now sometimes part of that segregation is related to the fact that certain environments are just not accessible. You know, you can't go certain places because the environments are not accessible to you because of your physical impairment. So these kinds of issues have very practical consequences. Like for people with intellectual disabilities, one of the questions is, should they be educated in a special segregated school off to the side? Or should they be included in the mainstream schools? And if they're included in the mainstream schools, how will we provide them with support that does not lead the other students to see them as inferior? So, because if that happens, then you will have segregation inside the school. And that's a problem too. So then you have a little empire of the normal inside the school, and the people with intellectual disabilities would be pushed off to the side. And how many of you have a relative or know a family where someone has a physical or an intellectual impairment and a disability? Raise your hands. Yeah, so then you have personal experience with some of this. And one of the issues is when you have a visible impairment, because everyone else is hiding their impairments, when you have a visible impairment and you enter the empire of the normal, people in the empire want to know, what happened to you? Why do you have this impairment? And so you have to develop a narrative, an impairment narrative or a deficiency narrative to explain your impairment to people. And this can be very tiring because every time you enter a new situation, more people say, why are you like this? And then you have to give your story. And sometimes after you give your story, the people go away. They don't want to know more about you. Because, that story is just about your impairment. It's not about you. So they don't give you a chance to talk about you and who you are. So, I know that Allie, my granddaughter, she has her impairment narrative. Somebody sees her hand and they say, "Why is your hand that way?" And she has her story. And she tells that story. And when she tells it 2 or 3 times in one day, she'll come home and she'll say, "Oh, I had to tell my story 3 times today. This was tiring." And but when in the empire of the normal, when you enter it with a visible impairment, that is the challenge. So all of us are operating by using ableist ideology. Not all of us, but many of us, because we will hide our impairments. And we create the illusion that everybody is normal in the same way, when in fact, we're not all normal in the same way. We all have variations in abilities. We all have little impairments here or there. And that's part of being a human being. Okay? So, but we hide that, and until we stop hiding those things, until we start seeing all of these variations as being a normal part of human life, ableist ideology will continue to exist. Now, there's 2 models that have been used to think about disability. And these models are not only sociological models, they're a combination of medical, sociological, and psychological models. But the model that has been used most frequently and for the longest time is the medical model of disability. And in the medical model of disability, the problem is the impairment that an individual has, okay? And the ultimate goal is to fix that impairment, all right? So people with disabilities are treated as passive recipients of treatment, of medical treatment. So because the impairment is the problem, disability is located in the individual, okay? So because the impairment is the problem, we have specialists who can diagnose and treat this impairment. We have doctors. We have surgeons who can do surgery to try to fix or minimize the impairment. We have psychiatrists who can help people in fixing their impairment. We have drug treatments that can maybe minimize some of the symptoms related to the impairment. And in addition to that, we have special training programs. We have special benefit agencies. We have special group homes to put people who have particular impairments. We have segregated activities. We have community mental health teams that are designed to treat people with impairments. So the medical model locates disability inside the person with the impairment. And this implies that an impairment is a personal defect, a personal deficiency, a personal inferiority that requires some kind of medical or technological fix to try to make the person normal. Okay? And that's the model that has been used in, at least in most Western societies, since the 1940s at least. And it's still being used. So one of the first things people think about when they see someone with a physical impairment, they think how could that be fixed? You know, but many of the people with the physical impairment say, look, this is how I was born. This is normal for me. I don't need to be fixed. I need to be treated with respect. I don't need to be fixed. So I'm not sick. I'm not deficient. I'm not abnormal. Okay? This is me. And so that particular model creates a whole set of community programs, orientations, and it actually reproduces the ableist ideology over time. Now, many people with disabilities said, we don't agree with the medical model. I don't want to be fixed. Okay? The big issue that I have is that my disability is located in a society that is organized around a system of social oppression, where the accommodations that are needed by many people are seen as extra things rather than as taken for granted parts of the designed environment. You know, I don't know if you have laws in Brazil about accessibility. You have laws. And in 1991 in the United States, we passed the Americans with Disability Act. And the Americans with Disability Act said that all public buildings have to be accessible. And of course, all of the people who saw themselves as able-bodied said, oh no, we've got to make all these changes. This is expensive, this is a problem, and they resisted the curb cuts, you know, on the street, so that people in a wheelchair or with certain walking devices could cross the street. They resisted those things. So the people with disabilities would get in their wheelchairs and have their walking assistive devices, and they would go to all of the public buildings and they would block the entrances. And, or they would go and in some cases disable the elevator, the mechanical elevator. And so they would make all the people take the stairs, or they would block the entrance so that people couldn't get into the building. And when the people said, get out of my way, you're inconveniencing me, they said, you've been inconveniencing me for my entire life. Now I'm showing you what it's like. You say this is a little inconvenience on one day? I do this every day of my life. So why don't you follow the new law? And it took, they were arrested, they had handcuffs. They would handcuff their wheelchair to the door handle, okay? And so the police then had to carry people with, who had cerebral palsy or double amputees or other people, carry them to jail. And when the cameras showed this, people were horrified, you know. They said, oh my gosh, you know, people with disabilities are being arrested and taken to jail. And so then those protests were very, very effective, very effective. And they started to get people to rethink the model that they were using to understand disability. So instead of locating the disability inside the person, they started to think, maybe we need to see a disability in terms of the environment that is inaccessible, in terms of relationships that don't acknowledge variations in different ability and potential. So, but that change is still very slow. And I still have a problem as I get older. I'm old, but as I get even more old, I think, why haven't we designed all of our houses so that access into the major rooms, if you're in a wheelchair or if you have a walking device, would be easy? Why do we make the doors in our bathrooms so narrow? Why do we, it's so easy to make that door when you're building a house. It costs no more extra money. You just make it a little bigger. And you make the hallway a little bigger. So it takes a square centimeter maybe out of a room, but you make a square meter out of a room, but you have a hallway that someone in a wheelchair could use. This is, in English, this is a no-brainer. I mean, this is just obvious that we should be designing everything, every new building. We should have a person with assistive devices and wheelchairs work with the architect. And I, at the University of Colorado where I taught, we built a new building, and the restrooms were not accessible. And so our students with wheelchairs, when it came for the break in the class, they would block the entrance to the toilets. And all of the students said, well, I've got to go to the toilet. And they said, too bad. Find an accessible toilet, because that's what I have to do. So the students would have to go to another building, and they said, this is a big inconvenience. And the students said, now you know how I feel. And they then got other students to work with them to get all of the bathrooms in this new building that should have been made accessible to begin with, remodeled, opened up so that you could use a wheelchair and use the toilet and the sinks. So the social model says that the source of the disability is in the world, outside of the individual, and it's manifested through distorted media coverage, prejudiced attitudes, ableist ideology, lack of inclusion, people who want to cure people with disabilities, fears, building design, social isolation, charity based on pity. It used to be, if you could bring someone out who was really deformed, then people would pity, they would feel pity and they would give money to this organization. So many of the disability organizations in the past, not today, but in the past, they would use ableist ideology to create pity to get money to care for people with disabilities. No accessible transportation, job locations are inaccessible, and this fear has been a big one, especially related to people with intellectual disabilities. Before the Special Olympics, people with intellectual disabilities were all kept inside because the medical model led people to think that if they were to enter the empire of the normal, they would become so excited and lose control and become a danger to people. And people were afraid of people with intellectual disabilities. They saw them as being threatening, as being potentially out of control. So the strategy was to keep them in isolation. And Eunice Kennedy, one of John Kennedy's, President Kennedy, way back in the 60s in the United States, his sister, they had 8 children, and one of the children had intellectual disabilities. And back then, they did brain surgery, where they went in and they turned off parts of the brain so that you would turn the person into very passive, they would have a difficult time walking, doing anything active. And they thought that was the way to at least partially fix the impairment. So Eunice Kennedy did reading, talked to many people, and she decided that there had to be a way to get people with intellectual disabilities outside of the house, outside of isolation, and that's why she created the Special Olympics. But the problem with the Special Olympics was that it didn't prepare people to do something outside of the Special Olympics, to maybe do a job. It didn't prepare the community to receive people in the rest of the community, to receive people with intellectual disabilities into the rest of the community. So the Special Olympics was helpful because it got people with intellectual disabilities out of the house. Many of them were obese because they didn't move. So this helped control some of the weight problems that people with intellectual disabilities had. But it didn't change ableist ideology. So the Special Olympics, which is one of the most effective fundraising NGOs in the world, have developed a new approach. And that is when many of their events now are called unified events. And they involve pairing a person with an intellectual disability with another person from the community. And those people will play together, compete with each other. And that way, people will be able to make friendships. And remember when I talked about the hookup, out of a poor neighborhood into the rest of the world? This provides people with intellectual disabilities with a hookup into the empire of the normal. Somebody who can help them get a job. Somebody who can maybe get them into an education program that will prepare them for a job. Someone who will introduce them to their friends, to other people, so that you can participate. When we have the party on Friday night, there would be people with intellectual disabilities there, and they would be interacting with us, and they would be included as part of things. So now the Special Olympics has a new model, and the model is built on the social model of disability, not the medical model. So those two models are very important. Yeah, Joe.
We're going to talk more about this, but when you go back to the other side, there is the distorted media coverage that to show that, and we know that from reading the chapter, all the things that you say there about the problems, like focus on the technological devices, or on the disabilities, or in the ability of the person to overcome everything and do whatever. But from your perspective, what would be an appropriate way for the media to talk about people with?
You mean in the coverage of the Paralympics?
Yeah.
Well, look, and this is other people are asking this question. And the big issue is that people with disabilities have not been prepared to be announcers on the Paralympics, okay? And people who have trained to be announcers don't know anything about life with certain impairments. So what we have had people from the empire of the normal. They are the commentators and the announcers for the Paralympics. And they talk about inspiration and overcoming challenges, and they just perpetuate the ableist ideology. But what we need are more people with disabilities getting into special journalism and media training programs so that they will be the announcers, so that they will talk about not this super crip, this super crippled person. That's a term from England. The Paralympic athletes, they watched how the Paralympics were being televised, and they say they think we're super crips, super crippled people, and we can do, crippled Do you know that word? Crippled means you can't walk, you're crippled, deformed, crippled. And so they said, when you listen to the Paralympics, you think that we're super crips. We can, you can just overcome your deficiency, your disability, your impairment, and you can do anything you want. And so the people are portrayed as being superhuman, and that's a distorted view. So when we watch the Paralympics, we don't learn anything about the everyday life of these athletes. When you see people with their $30,000 cheetah leg made by Lazer in Reykjavik, Iceland, on Oscar Pistorius and the other people who are now using the cheetah foot that's shaped like the back leg of a cat. When we see those people on the Paralympics, everybody's talking about how wonderful this is, but nobody talks about the fact that those legs cost $30,000 a piece, that they have to be tuned up on a regular basis, that oftentimes it takes a long time for them to be fit properly on your limb so that you don't get a sore, an open wound on your limb when you use it. They wear out, so you have to buy new ones. They don't show how difficult it is sometimes to get them on, to get them to fit properly. They don't show about their lives when they don't have those legs on. We never saw Oscar Pistorius walking on his knees around his own house without his cheetah legs. So we learn nothing about the everyday lives of those people. So we need to change the coverage of the Paralympics so that we learn more about who these people are every day, not just users of expensive technology, but people who are coping with challenges, inconveniences, and that they do need help, assistance, just like all of us need assistance at some point. This is normal. But we have to understand that needing assistance is normal. And we also have to understand that all of us who think that we're not disabled, we are only temporarily not disabled. Because tomorrow, you could have an accident and be in a wheelchair. So then, or as you get older, I can speak from experience, I cannot do many of the things that I could do when I was 25 years old. I can't play the sports the same way. I can't go on the same ski slopes as I did back then. I can't play at the same level in tennis. I can't swim at the same level. I can't do many things at the same level. Basketball, I can't jump. I used to be able to dunk. Now I can't. I have a hard time touching the net. So, all of those things. So, in a sense, my ability is changing. And now I might need some assistance in some cases. But this is a normal part of human life and aging. So we have to recognize, if we use ableist ideology, we don't recognize it. So I think in our coverage of the Paralympics, we need to change it so that instead of talking about how wonderful it is and how inspirational it is that people have overcome these obstacles, we have to learn more about how difficult it was and how there's still obstacles in their lives. It's not that they just run around all day on their cheetah legs. They have challenges And we need to understand more about them. Or else it doesn't change our ableist ideology. So my recommendation is, just like we need more women to be announcers for women's sports and men's sports, we need more black African Americans to be announcers for sports. We need also people with disabilities to be the announcers for Paralympic sports and for the Olympics. So we need more inclusion. Okay? This is the answer. Okay, one of the problems, and we started to talk about this, is we used to have all of these negative terms that people would use to refer to people with certain impairments. And now we've started to eliminate some of those terms. You know, spaz, which was short for spastic. Do you know what that means, spastic? Spastic means when someone doesn't have complete control over their muscles, you know, and they have jerky movements. Yeah. And sometimes we have used, when somebody's in a wheelchair and they have no use of their legs or arms, so forelimbs, we call them quads. People have called them quads. That's really not an appropriate term, okay? So, or paraplegic. So most languages have not had an adequate vocabulary that leads to inclusion, that emphasizes ability, that diffuses the fear of people with impairments as being others, as being separate from everyone else. And so this creates the illusion that human variation is insignificant. And if we want to eliminate that, then we need to come up with new words, a new vocabulary for how to talk. And this is what Aula was saying. We need to have a vocabulary of ability, not disability, not deficiency. And but to change the vocabulary in a language like that, a big challenge. And it will take, I say it will take at least 2 generations and maybe more before that will happen, even if we work hard. So when you live in the empire of the normal, you still have problems, okay? And we've talked about that. But let me just say this, and this is a challenge for those of us who work with the Paralympics and the Special Olympics, because Prolympic and power and performance sports are given a high priority in the empire of the normal. And by their very nature, they're exclusive. They cut out people that don't have high abilities. So this often isolates athletes with impairments, and it puts them into special programs where they receive special support and where they will not inconvenience the residents and the athletes in the empire, or force them to question their own definitions of normal. Okay? Because sometimes if we use ableist ideology in the back of our head and we see someone with an impairment, sometimes that reminds us of our own impairment. And that makes us uncomfortable. So the way to be comfortable is to keep people with visible impairments away from us so we don't have to think about our own little impairments. And so we end up with this segregation. And we need not just vocabulary, but we need programs that emphasize inclusion in new ways to break through that fear. So comments on that? So I'm looking for help because this is the first time I've talked about this, and I don't know if you're understanding, the points, or if you think I should be saying more things, or any comments or questions? Okay, this is an interesting photo because it shows this individual with his cheetah, right? Cheetah foot. He is got other prostheses too, okay? And to travel when you have certain kinds of disability or impairments, to travel is a problem because you have to take more equipment than other people. And so this shows this individual, he's making a change from his cheetah leg to his other prosthesis. And it would be good in the Paralympics to show that, to talk about that, and then to explain, the challenges that people are facing and when they participate. So, and when this person is asked time after time to answer the question, why my body is different from your body, that influences their identity. And when people ask you that all the time, then your impairment becomes too central in your life. Because other people are forcing you to constantly recognize it. Now, what do you do when you interact with someone with a particular impairment? You don't right away say, can I help you, or why is your body that way? You don't say those things. You enter a conversation the way you would with anyone else, and when you get to know that person, then you will know when they need help. People with certain disabilities, they don't need help all the time. So the first thing you say shouldn't be, do you need help? It should be, let's get to know each other. And then after you know each other a little bit, then it's perfectly appropriate to say, what's the story with your hand or whatever. And then you learn when somebody needs help. So you know that when you're walking and you get to a hill with a certain incline, then a person in a wheelchair would appreciate some help. But if it's just a normal little incline, they don't need help in some cases. So you would learn that through your interaction with them. And all of us need to be trained to do that, because unless we're around people with disabilities, impairments, we don't learn those things. Children are not taught those things in school. So, and that's a problem with our curriculum, is that we should be treating and we should be teaching children how to be inclusive of others with different abilities. And so when Aula was a little girl and saw her sister playing soccer, and she has a brace on her left leg, she was just a spectator. When she has a brace on her left leg, one of the first things that she asked is, she said, I want to play soccer. Will they let me play with my brace? And that's a big question for many people with physical impairments, because if you have certain kinds of braces, other players and their parents and youth folks would say, that brace could be dangerous. It could hurt my child. And Aula knew that. Well, they let her play because her brace was plastic, and it wasn't going to hurt anybody. So she started playing soccer. And this is related to Dora's question a little bit more, Well, too much of the coverage is patronizing, it's motivated by curiosity. There's stories of tragedies, you know, the accident someone had, that they lost their leg. They talk about inspiration, how mystifying the athletes are. Sometimes in the past, not so much today, they talk about with pity or surprise. And the irony of this coverage is that as the athletes in the Paralympics disrupt and challenge stereotypes about disabilities, the media coverage converts them into a different kind of others, as being the heroic supercritic or the courageous victim. And that's what we have to avoid in the commentary related to the Paralympics.
What's
Patronizing
patronizing?
is treating like a child. Okay, and you know, all of these factors, gender, race and ethnicity, social class, age and ability, they all intersect. They don't come just by themselves. So, you know, disability intersects with gender and with race and ethnicity in some cases, and certainly with social class. And women with disabilities are disadvantaged in cultures where femininity has been socially constructed in terms of heterosexual attractiveness. In cultures where heterosexual attractiveness is emphasized, a particular model of being a woman, an attractive woman, women with disabilities don't fit that model. So they're more likely to be disadvantaged in that kind of a culture. Okay? Because if you're not physically attractive to men, you're worthless. Okay? If you live in that kind of a culture, where there's that kind of an emphasis, and you have a physical impairment, then you have even greater challenges. Okay? You're at a greater disadvantage. And men with disabilities are disadvantaged in cultures where masculinity is socially constructed through narratives that emphasize strength and power and conquest and domination. And one of the biggest challenges for men, have you ever seen the documentary Murderball? Maybe Rafael can help you with this. It's a documentary of people who are playing wheelchair rugby. But the men who are playing wheelchair rugby, many of them had been born, you know, with no visible impairments. They grew up normal, so to speak, and they were engaged in high-risk activities, and they had an accident, and then they ended up, you know, with double amputee or an arm amputated, and so they play rugby, but they still have a sexist orientation. They still use gender ideology that emphasizes male superiority, that men should have power and strength. And now that they're in a wheelchair, this is a problem for them, because they used to think when they had a problem, I could beat that man up. You know, I could win in a fight with him. But now that they're in a wheelchair, they can't say that anymore. So they say, I'm no longer a man because I can't beat people up. And so they have to adjust to that. Well, in wheelchair rugby, they still can use that orientation. They can say, I can, be more powerful than the other players. I can ram my wheelchair into them. I can knock them over. I can still be a man in wheelchair rugby because I can dominate other people. And if you can't dominate, then you can't be a man. That's how some people. So wheelchair rugby is an interesting one because when we watch it, we say, oh man, this is really amazing. But sometimes it perpetuates the very orientations that led to their accident to begin with. And this whole distorted idea about masculinity and power and strength and conquest and domination. So, and some people with disabilities fear being identified as subnormal. Therefore, they don't play sports. And that's the problem that Aula has right now, 16 years old. And she can play some sports, but she doesn't want other people to see her as having a disability. And she knows that if she goes out and tries out for the sport, people are going to notice her impairment. And they're going to call her disabled, and they're going to mark her as being inferior. She's going to be dissed, and she doesn't want to be dissed. So to avoid being dissed, she doesn't play sports. So she and I run together, and she's a good runner, wonderful endurance, and she can do that. But when she tried out for the cross-country team, the distance running team at her middle school, and her brace, did I tell you this? It rubbed on her foot, and her whole shoe filled up with blood. And so when she took off her shoe, and she wouldn't stop, partly because she has no feeling in her foot, but partly because she didn't want other people to see her impairment. So she kept running, and then the injury was so bad, she couldn't even wear her brace for 2 months. So, so we went to a special person who makes prosthetic devices for Paralympians, but it's very difficult to get that to fit right because she's, she grows and changes, and so until she's fully grown, it's really difficult to get a device that's going to fit her without creating problems. So even running can be a problem. So, so when we run a 5K race together, I check, and when the brace starts causing a problem, we take the brace off and she runs without it. But she lives when she runs without it, and she's a little embarrassed about that. So, but that's the one thing that she can do that isn't going to make her impairment visible to her peers. Okay? So there are certain forms of mobility technology now that can be used in adaptive sports. And one of the big questions is, why don't we have schools that have more adaptive sport teams? That bring students together, students with various impairments together, so that they can support each other. And why don't we have teams that mix people of different abilities? So now, I've played wheelchair basketball, for example, with people who are in wheelchairs. And that's one possibility. It's not a perfect way to solve problems, but it's a way to bring people together, to have good social experiences together, to get to know each other, and to see each other eye to eye, in wheelchair to wheelchair. And so we need more of those programs in our schools so that we could have a mixed team, a basketball team with 2 people who really live in a wheelchair, 3 people who don't. And then we play another sport with the same numbers. And we have a wheelchair basketball game. And then we all get together after the game and have a pizza. And get to know each other. So we need ability mixed teams so that we can challenge ableism. Now sports, for those of you who are working with the Paralympics, this is an important point. Sports are really a place where there are struggles going on right now. Struggles related to inclusion. And because sports are highly visible and culturally valued activities, and if you want to become a part of the group and you're 16 years old and you have a particular impairment, if you could play sports with people, that would make you feel like you're really a part of the group and a part of your peers. Because sports are culturally important. And sports are also believed to be unique socializing activities, important for self-reaffirmation, important for social acceptance, health, and well-being. And so it's important for people with disabilities to be included in sports, because that's one way to enter into the empire of the normal, so to speak. But sport resources go primarily to those, should be with elite sports skills. Okay? And that's one of the problems, is we only have so much money for sport. Are we going to spend it to win gold medals? Or are we going to spend it for inclusion? And that's a political issue. So, and usually the decision is, we spend it to win gold medals. So, but it doesn't have to be that way. So we've talked about many of the barriers so far, at least inferred them. This is one of the good ones that we didn't talk about. Well, a few. One of the barriers that we need to overcome is the shortage of expertise in creating participation opportunities that people with disabilities will perceive as welcoming. People don't get no training. People get no training on that. And we need more programs around physical education programs and other programs that will help people develop the expertise so that they can make programs be welcoming for people with various disabilities. And that's a trick. It's not easy to do that. And then there are overprotective family members. And many families lack the resources to support regular participation in sport. But many families are really overprotective. They don't want their child with a disability to be in sport where it could be dangerous, they might get hurt. And so parents oftentimes protect their children and keep them out of sport because they think it could be dangerous. And it's important to help people develop the expertise to talk with those parents, to let them know that we have adapted sports. We have sports that are not dangerous for your child. So you can allow them to participate with me and feel safe, feel that it's okay. So those are changes that are needed. And right now, there are a few advocates with power and influence to mandate the elimination of barriers in gymnasiums, tracks, and other sport facilities. Okay? And because most of the programs for people with disabilities, it's one day every 6 months. And, that's no good. You get someone who are really interested, and they have to wait 6 months for their next opportunity. So we need regular opportunities. And in the United States, this is an interesting development. it's difficult for children to play baseball with disabilities, physical disabilities. So they've developed a playing surface that's all smooth. So that if you're in a wheelchair or you have an assistive device, or if you have cerebral palsy and you drag a foot when you run and so on, you're not going to trip on the grass or little imperfections in the surface. But these are expensive. But they enable people with many kinds of physical disabilities to play baseball who couldn't play otherwise. And now in the United States, we're building more accessible parks, adapted parks. And you may have them in Brazil too. And so we have parks now with tracks with a running guide for people who have no vision, so that they can run around the track without another human being their guide. And all of the equipment is accessible. But it's also good for people who don't have physical impairments. So you can have people participating in the playground together. But it takes clever people to design those playgrounds and those playing surfaces. Okay, we've covered most of the material. Yeah. Okay. So this is a sign from England. Okay. Inclusion changes disability into visibility. So, which is exactly what Aula was talking about. Okay. And there are contexts where people are giving each other a hand there. This is mountain biking and a special mountain biking wheelchair costs about $8,000. But even with a mountain biking wheelchair, it's tough to get up certain hills. So a friend gives a hand. So, pardon me? Oh, the picture? Yeah. Okay. No? Okay. Okay. This is a swimmer. And I talk about her in the chapter. Now, one of the big issues that people don't talk about usually is sport as a cause of disability. And that's we won't spend a lot of time talking about it now. We'll talk more about this when we talk about commercialization tomorrow. But as sports become commercialized, there's pressure to engage in more dangerous moves. And when you watch the X Games, when you've seen people in their snowmobiles, for example, in the Winter X Games, doing the tricks in the big snowmobiles and landing and breaking their neck and not ever, losing the ability to move their legs with a spinal injury and so on. So athletes with disabling injuries create all sorts of challenges because they have to move from their former idea of their able selves to a new idea about themselves. A person with a serious physical impairment. All right? So sports sometimes can help people with disabilities, but sports can sometimes cause disabilities. And the only other issues are the tension between the IOC and the IPC. There's never been a good, positive relationship between those two organizations. And you know, if you've read the chapter, you know about those stories, but the IOC has its own brand, has its own symbols, and they don't want the IPC to have a brand and symbols that are too close, that would maybe threaten the IOC's ability to make money. You know, in the U.S., this is a big tension because the Paralympics want to raise money from corporations to support their training, and the other federations and the USOC say, wait a minute, we talk with United Airlines. You can't talk with United Airlines. That's our sponsor. But the USOC has talked to all the big corporations. So what is the Paralympic supposed to do? There's no corporations left for that. So there's tension for raising money. Because in the United States, the government doesn't provide any money for the Paralympics or for the Olympics. The only exception is if you're a former soldier and you were wounded in the military, then you get a special rehabilitation allowance or stipend. And you can use, if you play Paralympic sports, they see that as part of your rehab. So they give you that stipend. But that creates tension inside the Paralympics. Because the people who were born with impairments and have worked for 20 years to make the Paralympic team, now a soldier comes from Afghanistan with this money from the government to do training, with all of this former athletic training before they, you know, went into the military, and they come and they say, we want to do skiing, you know, in a chair, or we want to do the running races, and then they beat out the person who has the impairment from birth, and then they start complaining. All the soldiers are taking our position. This is unfair. You know, maybe they ought to have a special program just for soldiers who don't have legs. So there's tension between people within the Paralympics, and that's a big. Probably not a problem in Brazil. It's a big problem in the United States because we have so many soldiers who have their legs missing, arm missing, and other physical impairments because of all the wars the United States feels compelled to fight all over the world. So basically, there's all sorts of tension between IOC and IPC, and then inside various Paralympic organizations. Okay, the big thing that you will see in 2016 is a new change in Paralympic classifications. And you know much more about this than I do, but maybe you can explain. So there's going to be a new way to classify people with impairments because there were, and this is a commercialization issue, there were so many categories to compete in that it was difficult to organize the Paralympics, to get all of the races in, to have television coverage and all of this. So now they're trying to revise the classification system to minimize the number of categories so that you can televise the entire event and so that it's easier to schedule the events and so on. So those new categories, are they out now? The new ones are published. They come out, they're supposed to come out any day. But they will be used for 2016. And this will be a big challenge for the Paralympics because the classification system for the Paralympics has been a very cumbersome system. You have to prove that you have a certain amount of deficiency or disability to be in this category rather than this category. Because if you know, if you're in this category, you'll have a better chance of winning up. So you have to prove how bad you are. And that's another problem with the classification system in the Paralympics. So I have talked enough. You have listened enough. I will look at other things, see if there's anything else we should cover on disability-related issues. I want to talk a little bit about age and aging because the whole world is becoming older. And so participation in sport among older people is becoming an issue. So we'll talk a little bit about that next time. And then we'll move into commercialization and the media. I'll try to merge those two together. So thank you for listening today, and I'll see you tomorrow.